generous introduction. Deserved for David, much for David thanking me of it. David's a good friend. I want to thank all of you for coming, and David, thank you for your very insightful remarks. You're right, they're very different from what I expected you to say. This is a very important topic. I'm glad we've got a complete house, full house. I just want to quote, before I ask you a question, as you know, this past week's been a very active week in Beijing with the meeting of the Chinese National People's Congress, and I'm going to quote Xi Jinping from the speech. He says, "Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-around containment, encirclement, suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to China. It has been pointed out, while some may think that's just standard rhetoric, that's the first time that a leader of China since the era of Mao Zedong has directly talked or accused the U.S. of interfering in China. So that was a big step. And recently, just the day afterwards, our acquaintance, Master Xingang, defended that, saying that China had the right to respond. So how do, based upon that, how would you classify the current state of U.S.-China relations?
Well, Charles, thanks for that question. And short answer first, I think there's no question in my mind, and I think many would agree, and Charles, I think you would agree that really the U.S.-China relationship right now is, I think, at a low water mark that we haven't seen subsequent to normalization in 1979. There have been some shocks to the system in U.S.-China relations over the last 40-some years, but overall, I think the level of trust that we see is at an all-time low. The level of suspicion about the intentions of the other side is at an all-time high, and I think the relationship is in a very strained and challenged place right now. And I think the phrase I often think of when I think about where the relationship is going is I think things are going to get worse before they get worse. And it's a pretty bad state of affairs. And I think it makes the kind of work that AsianSociety does and that the Bush-China Foundation does and so many other organizations all the more important, because there is a lot of mistrust and suspicion between the governments. And so when citizens can come together and create platforms for honest exchange, I think that's a very important thing to do. And the last thing I would say, referencing the point that you made about Xi Jinping and also our friend, Foreign Minister Qin Gang, is that I think one of the things that struck me about the very specific and blunt reference to the United States as being a major source of China's problems is that China is now starting to do the same thing that we're doing here with respect to China. Because let's be honest about what we're doing in this country. What we're saying in this country is, in essence, our problems are too hard to fix, so let's just focus on a foreign adversary and divert attention from the fact that we, the elected leadership of our nation, aren't doing a heck of a lot to solve our own problems. So let's use the foreign baddie as a way of explaining to the people why we have all the problems that we do. And guess what? Now China is learning from us and doing that as well. Not that they necessarily needed to learn from us, but we certainly are doing it, they're doing it, and that creates a very difficult dynamic in the relationship.
I just thought I'd put in a plug with the AsianSociety mentioned that, speaking of Foreign Minister Xingang, it wasn't that long ago that the AsianSociety hosted him as the ambassador of the People's Republic of China at a roundtable discussion right here. You were there, Roberto. Okay, next. As Marty mentioned, recently the speaker has indicated that rather than going to Taiwan, he will meet the president of Taiwan somewhere else in the next few weeks. What do you attribute that change to, and do you think that could have been at the suggestion of the government of Taiwan?
You know, it's a great question, and it does appear that the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, will meet President Tsai Ing-wen in the coming weeks here in the United States, evidently scrapping plans for the time being, at least, of going to Taiwan as Speaker Pelosi did. You know, I've seen reports that suggest that various voices weighed in and indicated, in essence, and these are my words, kind of summarizing what I've seen in the media, but basically, hey, Mr. Speaker, this is going to cause a shock to the system. Why don't you meet President Tsai Ing-wen in the United States? It's still going to be a shock, but maybe a little less of one than it would be if you were to yet again, go to Taiwan and follow in the footsteps of Speaker Pelosi. So I think there probably was some calibration around that. But the larger point is that when the Speaker of the House of Representatives meets the President of the Republic of China, then wherever that happens, that is going to cause heartburn and anger. In China, it's going to be perceived by China as a flagrant and egregious violation of their sovereignty, of China's sovereignty. That's a long-standing position. And so while there may be a very slight difference in degree of the shock value of the meeting occurring here during a transit executed on the part of Tsai Ing-wen rather than in Taiwan, all in all, it's still going to be a major shock to the system. And let's remember that we've never had, subsequent to normalization, a scenario in which two successive speakers of the House of Representatives of the United States have met with the leadership of Taiwan or visited Taiwan in such close proximity to each other. So Newt Gingrich went to Taiwan in 1998, 1997, I believe, and then the next visit of a speaker was 25 years later. And now you've got one just a few months later. And if I'm looking into the crystal ball, my presumption will be that every Speaker of the House going forward in perpetuity will meet with the President of Taiwan. And of course, that will be a new irritant that, and more than irritant from the standpoint of China, that we have to manage in the relationship as we go forward.
And the other thing is, David, China used as a pretext to test their planes, their military operations, when Pelosi went to the island of Taiwan, the main island of Taiwan, so maybe that was another reason he decided not to go. As you pointed out, the relationship of China, the People's Republic of China toward Taiwan has varied at different times. It wasn't that long ago China was establishing exchanges, mail service, plane service. You know all that so much better. Do you think it's possible that our support of Taiwan can backfire to the extent that the more, as you say, that we're expressing a strong support for Taiwan and doing all these acts, it actually accelerates concerns in the People's Republic of China, and they take increasingly more aggressive positions following what we're doing.
I do think, Charles, that dynamic is there. And I think, again, it's kind of the law of unintended consequences. I think we in the United States tend at this point to want to rush to show our supportiveness of Taiwan, not necessarily thinking through the second and third order effects of what that could mean in terms of China's actions in response. And what we end up seeing is kind of we trigger China, China triggers us, and we get into a self-perpetuating cycle that escalates and generates higher levels of tension. And it's probably coming from a place of good intentions in terms of the United States and wanting to show support for a great friend, a fellow democracy, a society that shares our values, an island of 23 million that has done some incredible things and has logged some incredible achievements. But sometimes the things that we do to show our support probably net end up making Taiwan's net security position worse than it was before. One of the points I made when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan was I said that I think that visit was in fact consistent with the one China policy of the United States for one simple reason, that even a visit to a place by a Speaker of the House of Representatives does not formally change the fact at all that we still do not extend formal diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, and we still do extend formal diplomatic recognition to the mainland, because that is unchanged. you can make these visits in a way that accords with the de jure spirit or the de jure, the letter of the One China policy. But that being said, was it a wise move? Did it advance U.S. interests in any discernible way? Did it advance Taiwan's interests in any discernible way? One could certainly make the argument that while it was consistent with U.S. policy, it didn't necessarily do anything good for us or for Taiwan. And I think we're so emotional in this country as we think about these policy choices that we don't take the time to go through, look at the substance of the issues, and make dispassionate decisions about what advances the interests of the United States. And it's all about the photo op, it's all about being able to go back to constituents with an easy bumper sticker message. And as I often point out, good politics does not generally translate or always translate into good policy.
Exactly. Of course, we all know that it was just a few weeks ago, it seems like a year ago, that the big issue was the what we came to believe was the Chinese surveillance balloon and all the issues surrounding that. Why don't you put that in perspective? I know some have speculated, asked whether or not whether actually the right hand knew what the left hand knew was doing, because it did create a very important trip for Secretary Blinken. And secondly, was there a little hypocrisy about us being concerned about China spying on us when it's widely reported that we're able to detect what Xi Jinping is thinking in his inner circles? We've got someone spying right there.
Yeah, Charles, I think you're right. That a couple of things. One, look, the United States spies on China, China spies on us. We do it via a variety of means and technologies, including satellite technologies. And the U.S. Defense Department and the U.S. intelligence community specifically said repeatedly, right after the balloon episode, got into the news and so forth, that the additive value, and that was the phrase they used, the additive value of the balloon was nil, was zero, relative to what China already has the ability to do to us and what we have the ability to do to them. So from a substantive standpoint, our own defense community and our own intelligence community says this was a non-issue. But the fact that Americans could look up in the sky and literally see something floating over the vast expanse of our nation and take videos of it. And some people sent me the videos that they took, and including in South Carolina, where literally someone shared a video that they took where the missile went into the balloon and took it down. And they were partying on the beach, and they were like saying, wow, look at that. And so this became real for the American people. The minute before this story broke, China was doing things to us that were much more consequential than the balloon. The minute after the story broke, they were still doing those things. But what this did was it gave a tangibility and a concreteness to the issue to the average person who could see this with their naked eye. And so the United States, from a political standpoint, had to respond to it. And might I add, President Biden was just about to give the State of the Union address in Congress 2 days after this story first broke. And from a political standpoint, anyone can understand. He had to be able to say to both chambers of Congress and to the American people, I took it down. And I think if this State of the Union had been at some other time or had already occurred, there might have been a different choice, etc. But there's a lot of hypocrisy on both sides. There's a lot of anger and feigned anger and positioning and posturing. But the reality is, the balloon is a negligible sort of sub-story of the broader dynamics of what's happening in the relationship.
As you know better than me, one administration after another has followed a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding whether or not we would come to the defense of Taiwan in case there was a direct attack by China, on the grounds that we did not want to give Taiwan sort of the power to that would result in the U.S. going to war with China, and so therefore strategic ambiguity. As you also know, President Biden has recently rather directly contradicted that by saying, yes, we would come to the defense of China. So Where is that policy, and was it a good idea? If we have abandoned it, was that a good idea?
You know, Charles, it's a great question, and it's a question that's been on my mind and the mind of a lot of others since President Biden made the very remarks that you just referenced. And just to be clear, for those who didn't hear it, on 60 Minutes, a journalist asked President Biden, if China attacks Taiwan, will you, as the commander-in-chief of our nation, send U.S. troops to defend Taiwan? And President Biden said, and I quote, yes. And the reporter was so surprised by that he said, well, wait a minute, let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that if China were to attack Taiwan, that you would send U.S. troops to defend Taiwan? And President Biden said, yes. So this was not a slip of the tongue. This was not a gaffe. This was not something that was, in the course of a long set of remarks and some wires got crossed and a different message came out. This was a very intentional statement. And that statement, as you rightly point out, Charles, directly contravenes established U.S. policy, to the point where the White House itself and the State Department the next day said, our policy hasn't changed. Now, this is one of the, in fact, that was the exact words, our policy hasn't changed. Our policy remains unchanged. This is one of the examples that I could have mentioned, and I mentioned others, of how what we say, or what one part of the government says and what the other part of the government says, often generates inconsistency, generates confusion. And the simple truth is, to kind of conclude on this point, the very fact that President Biden said something that directly contradicts our established policy is probably the very exemplification of strategic ambiguity. We are being as ambiguous as we possibly can because we are saying things that are precisely the opposite of other things that are said by our government and that are presumed to be authoritative. But let me say one last thing. It's an editorial comment that I would make. And again, it's just my opinion, to take or leave as you see fit. And I feel a little self-conscious saying it, but I'll say it anyway. President Biden is wrong. We would not send American troops to defend Taiwan. There's one reason we wouldn't do that. Now, let me be clear. President Biden is the sitting president, the commander-in-chief. He has the constitutional authority to do anything he wants to do within the laws of our nation. But the reason we won't do it, in my judgment, the reason he was wrong when he said that factually, is for the same reason that we're not sending troops to Ukraine to defend Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. It's because we're dealing with a nuclear-armed state, a nuclear weapons state with intercontinental reach that could blow us back to the Stone Age and that we could destroy. And because of the principle of mutual assured destruction, and because of the principle of nuclear deterrence, we're no more going to fight a potential nuclear Armageddon-like war with China than we are with Russia. Russia can make the rubble bounce 25 times. China can make the rubble bounce